Hello. I have my fourth round game from the George O'Rourke Memorial for you today. I was on board one again, and I was paired against the second highest rated player in the tournament, Roger Cappallo. He had the white pieces, and going into this game, I had a score of 3 out of 3, as did he. And he pretty consistently plays better than I do in the opening. So, in preparation for this game, I did a little bit of opening study. Even going as far as to memorize one variation that was 19 moves deep. And then on move 1, he played e4. And all my preparation went out the window because I was expecting d4. So I played e5. He played knight f3, knight c6, and bishop to c4, which is the Italian game. I responded with bishop c5. He castled kingside, I played knight f6, and he played d3. And I should stop here to say that I know very little about this opening, so some of the things I say may be wrong. In fact, a lot of them may be wrong, and I think I'll have to check with the computer to find out for sure whether or not I played this acceptably. I played d6 with the idea that now I can play knight a5 maybe and grab this bishop on c4 now that my e-pawn is protected. He played c3, preparing d4. And as evidence of how little I know about this opening, I thought that d4 coming up for white would be suboptimal because white played d3 first. But having looked at an opening database since the game, this is very normal and theoretically acceptable. White looks like he's also stopping knight a5 because there's going to be a fork of my minor pieces with b4. And I didn't really like the looks of knight takes c4 and b takes c5. I played h6. I'm not sure this was necessary. I tried not to make these flank pawn moves to stop pins unless the pin really seems like it's going to be a pain in the butt. And I didn't want white to be able to play bishop to g5. But I think in hindsight maybe this wasn't necessary and I could just have castled kingside. And if white pins me on g5, perhaps I can kick it away with h6 and maybe even play g5. Or I could do something like queen e7, bishop e6, and then after a trade of bishops, I would have my queen on a square from which it defends the knight without the knight being pinned. And after that I can move the knight away. But I played kind of scared chess here and made the move h6. Roger played a4. And again, I didn't like this move very much during the game. I thought instead white should either go for d4 right away, or should play b4, bishop b6, and then a4, when white is threatening to win a piece with a5, so I'd probably have played a5 myself, and then he can play b5, and he's made all these moves with tempo and has gained a bunch of space on the queen side. But again, looking at an opening database, it seems that a4 is a normal kind of move, so I guess I just don't really know what I'm talking about when it comes to the Italian. I played a5, looking to stop the piece-winning combination b4, bishop b6, a5, and Roger played d4. So I guess this is where I really started to feel uncomfortable. I had been dreading the move d4 for a couple moves, and it was finally played. And I just don't know how black typically responds to this kind of thing. I wanted to play bishop to b6, but I thought that after d takes e5, d takes e5, queen takes d8, no matter how I recapture, I lose a pawn. If knight takes d8, then there's knight takes e5, and white is even going to grab maybe this pawn on f7 later, certainly if I redevelop the knight. And if I take back with the king, he has bishop takes f7. But what I guess I missed is that black has knight takes e4 here. And white can't even respond to that with rook e1 because it would hang the pawn on f2. So this was an acceptable variation, and for that reason I think I should have played this instead of what I played, which was e takes d4. Because after Roger c takes d4, he has a nice center compared to mine, and for that reason a lot more space. I played bishop to b6, and now I guess I'm looking to play d5 at some point as a way of trying to gain some center space and force the trade of e-pawn for d-pawn one way or another, leaving white with an isolated d-pawn. And then I'd be trying to occupy the square in front of it with my pieces, trade some minor pieces off, and enter some kind of major piece endgame with a small edge. h3 from Roger. I guess maybe maybe here he should have done something to defend the pawn on e4. I'm not sure exactly what. I guess he'd like to defend it with the queen, but that's tied down to the defense of the d-pawn. But, I mean, maybe, and he can't really play queen d3, can he? Because I'll get my knight b4 move with tempo. So I really don't know what white should have done here. But what happened in the game is he played h3, I castled kingside, and now there's a real predicament for white, and maybe this predicament also existed on the previous move, I'm not sure. And that's that I would like to take this pawn for free, of course, but even if Roger defends it, as he did in the game with knight c3, I can take the pawn as the start of an instance of the fork trick, with the idea that after knight takes e4, I have d5 forking these pieces. And this is a nice trick to know as a way not to win material, but to destroy an opponent's large pawn center. Excuse me. And as it turns out, the normal way of responding to the fork trick, which is to recapture with the knight, and in response to the fork, to retreat the bishop and recapture on the knight's square with that bishop, doesn't work here because after bishop to d3, d takes e4, bishop takes e4, this pawn on d4 is hanging. So in response to knight takes e4, Roger had to play something else. But I want to go back for a second and point out that even if there is a way for white to defend this e4 pawn here, I think I'll be playing d5 next, forcing the exchange of those pawns, and we'll have a decent position because of my control of the square in front of the isolated queen pawn. Knight to c3, knight takes e4. Roger decided to play bishop takes f7 check, which makes sense. It's the move that holds on to material here. Rook takes f7, and knight takes e4. But in order to keep material equal, he has had to cede the two bishops. And now this light squared bishop can come to f5, and though he can counterattack it with knight g3, once it retreats to h7, it's controlling a lot of good squares, and if the knight ever goes to b4, there will be some decent coordination. Roger played bishop to e3, and it's at this point in the game that I made a move that I wish I hadn't. I had a couple options here. One is to try to keep that d4 pawn on target by playing d5, and to keep this bishop on e3 bad. But that gives up the e5 square, and that's what I did in the game, and it turns out to have caused me some consternation. I think instead I should just have moved my knight somewhere, maybe b4, where it can, from which it can coordinate with the bishop on h7 to get into some light squares in white's camp. And if white responds with d5, I can just trade on e3, maybe even use this e5 square later. I'm not really sure why I didn't go for this. I think I just saw this position in my mind and thought, well, it's going to be hard to get my knight from b4 to e5, therefore I don't want this position. But in hindsight, that doesn't make a lot of sense. Instead, I played d5, as I said, and now the threat of this white knight coming into e5 makes it hard for me to move my knight on c6 away. which makes it hard for me to make use of the b4 square and hard to make use of these light squares. And because my pawn's on d5, and because my knight can't move for that reason, it's hard to play c6, and for that reason impossible to reactivate the bishop on b6. So I really think I should not have played d5. Roger played rook c1, and this is an interesting move because there are lines in which it's going to be a good idea to sacrifice an exchange on c6. But I guess I wasn't super afraid of it. I played queen d6, but even queen d7, which allows rook takes c6, when any recapture from black allows white to play knight e5 as a major piece fork, didn't seem bad to me. I thought I would just retake with the queen, and after knight e5, move that queen somewhere, let's say to d6. And white can take this rook on f7, but I just thought I still have the two bishops, material is equal, I still like my position. This knight on g3 is not very good. I think, though, I was seeing some kind of thing like this. Queen f3 check, king g8, and then the use of the f5 square. I was worried about that, and I was also worried that earlier in the variation, white might just not retake on f7. He might just leave his knight on e5, and then it might be hard for me to deal with that minor piece. So I decided just to avoid this variation. Oh, and also after queen d7, if I ever move my knight away, of course, white just has a straight exchange-winning fork on e5. So I elected to go queen d6 instead. But again here, if he had played rook takes c6, I think I was going to respond with queen takes c6. And after knight e5, we're back in that same variation after queen d6. Instead, he played queen d2. And there are some interesting tactical things going on now. I've got pressure on the knight on g3, so I played rook e8, making it the case that should this queen ever leave the defense of the bishop on e3, I may be able to play rook takes e3, f takes e3, queen takes g3. And Roger played knight e2. I think this is a mistake. This is a pretty tactically charged position, and right now white can't make use of the squares he wants to make use of, like f5 or e5 or the f4 square. All of these are adequately defended by black. But when he plays knight e2, but that's sort of also the case for black. I can't use any of these squares. I can't use f4, I can't use e4. I guess I could stick my bishop on f5, but I'm not sure what that would accomplish. But after Roger's knight e2, which aims to make use of this f4 square, he has given up control of e4. And in such a, I mean, I think this is a sharp position. In such a sharp position, a backwards knight move like that has the potential to lead to disaster. I played bishop to e4 because he gave up the e4 square, and of course I'd love to take on f3 now, which would destroy white's kingside pawn structure and remove his best minor piece, the one that is constantly threatening to go into e5. Roger played bishop f4, which I didn't even analyze before playing bishop e4, I have to admit. For some reason I only considered the knight coming to f4. But this turns out, I think, still to leave black with a good position. I played queen to f6. And again, here I still intend bishop takes f3. And if I can get that move in, I can even then play rook takes e2 and queen takes f4. Roger played knight e5. The major alternative, I think, was bishop e5, in which case I was going to capture the bishop on e5, and I guess he would have retaken with his knight. And then, let's see, how would things have gone from here? Don't exactly remember what I was planning. I'm sorry, I'm a little bit sick today, so I'm not putting a ton of effort into this video, but I'm sure I had something planned here. My rook's under attack on f7. I wonder if I wasn't just going to sack an exchange on e5. Yeah, I'm sorry, I don't remember. So, He played knight to e5 instead, and I traded that knight. He played bishop takes e5. And though this puts a nice bishop on e5, black has a bunch of pieces over on white's king side and can launch an attack here. So I played queen g6. And a big part of this attack is the bishop on e4, which wouldn't be attacking right now if this white knight were still on g3, from which it could take the bishop. Alright, so white has a problem here, which is that he's threatened with checkmate on g2, and he can respond to that in something like 4 superficially reasonable looking ways. One of them is g3, another is f3, now there's knight f4, and there's knight g3. And I think 3 of these lose on the spot, and one kind of holds on and continues the game, and might even leave white with a reasonable position. And that move is g3. Now white, as Roger pointed out after the game, can play knight to f4, which comes with tempo because it hits the queen. Or he can bring his knight to c3 to try to trade off this attacking light-squared bishop. White's still in the game at this point, at least as far as I know. The moves that don't work are f3, which seems to just hang material because the g-pawn is pinned and black's attacking this f3 square more times than white's defending it. Knight f4, which defends the g2 square for one move, but is responded to, of course, with rook takes f4. And what Roger played, knight to g3. This threatens, of course, to take the bishop on e4, and it blocks the checkmate threat. So if black doesn't have anything here, then white is successfully defending himself. But unfortunately, there's the move rook takes e5. And now if d takes e5, black gets queen takes g3 because of the pinned f-pawn. But this is even worse than a rook for a couple minor pieces, because white now can't stop queen takes g2 checkmate with anything other than queen g5. And if knight takes e4, eliminating that attacker, I can play rook takes e4, which leaves black up a piece. I guess as a final option, perhaps white could have tried f3, but I think again, after queen takes g3, f takes e4, black is up a piece. You could just play something like rook takes f1 check, rook takes f1, rook takes e4. And now d4 is dropping. So in this position, after rook takes e5, Roger resigned. It wasn't a long game, but I think it was a complex one and difficult for both sides. And he definitely took me by surprise with the move e4. So I'm going to have to watch out in the future. Alright, thank you for watching. I'm at a score of 4 out of 4, so I'm a half point ahead of the rest of the field, and I'm going to be playing a young man named Ritvik Pulya next week. So I will bring that game to you next Thursday. Thank you for watching.